If you show up there, you'll lose everything I've been protecting for you, and I won't be able to stop it. The day Marcus Hale opened the doors of his own architecture firm was supposed to be the proudest moment of his life. He had spent 27 years building toward it, but his son Daniel never walked through those doors. For 3 years, Marcus had told himself it was grief, or distance, or the collateral damage of a bad divorce. Then Ryan Cole showed up, the son of Marcus's late best friend, and handed him a photograph that changed everything Marcus thought he understood about why his son had stayed away. What followed wasn't just a fight over a forged signature or a stolen share of a company. It was the uncovering of 3 years of quiet, deliberate damage done to a father and son who had never stopped reaching for each other through a wall neither of them knew was there. My name is Marcus Hale. I'm 53 years old. And I spent nearly 3 decades as a licensed architect working for other people's visions before I finally built something that was entirely my own. I'm the kind of man who measures twice and cuts once not because I'm slow, but because I've learned the cost of rushing something that has to stand. I don't raise my voice when I'm angry. I get quiet. I get organized. And I don't move until I know exactly what I'm standing on. The morning of the grand opening, I arrived at the office 40 minutes before anyone else. I had done this every day for the 14 months we'd been building the space, out walking the floor before the noise started, running my hand along the edge of a countertop, checking the tolerances on a door, hinge the way most people check their phone. The building was a converted 1940s warehouse in the Riverside district, and when the light came in through those original factory windows at 7 in the morning, it landed on the concrete floor in long amber strips that reminded me of something I couldn't name but recognized as mine. I stood at the window with a cup of coffee going cold in my hand and looked at the sign above the front door. Hale Design Group. 27 years of drafting tables and other men's letterheads and conference rooms where my name appeared in the fine print. And now it was right there in brush steel. 48-point font. Visible from the street. I had called Daniel the night before. He didn't pick up. I left a voicemail, nothing elaborate. Just the address. The time. The words, "I'd really like you to be there." I'd said some version of that to him 4 or 5 times over the past year, in different contexts and with different excuses for why it never seemed to land. The divorce had been finalized 3 years ago, and in that time Daniel had graduated from college, turned 24, and somewhere along the way had drifted into the habit of answering my calls with texts. Brief ones. The kind that answered the literal question without answering anything else. I was used to it by then, or I told myself I was. The guests started arriving at 10. Colleagues. Contractors. 2 city planning officials I'd worked with on a mixed-use development in the North Corridor. A handful of clients, old and new. My office manager, Patricia, had put together a spread of food that probably cost more than my first car. And someone had ordered flowers that were too tall for the tables they were placed on. But it didn't matter because the light made everything look like it belonged. Ryan Cole walked in at 10:15. I hadn't seen him in 8 months, and he'd filled out since then, broader through the shoulders. Something more settled in his face. He was 25 now, and he had his father's way of entering a room without announcing himself. Just appearing at your elbow as if he'd been there for a while, and you'd only just noticed. His father, Greg, had been my closest friend for 30 years. Greg had died 4 years ago. A cardiac event at 51 that had no warning and no logic and left a hole in my life that I'd mostly learned to work around. Ryan was the only piece of Greg I still had regular access to. He shook my hand with both of his and looked around the office slowly, the way his father used to assess a space before he said anything about it. He would have loved this, Ryan said. That was all. It was enough. We spent most of the morning in different corners of the room, working the crowd the way you do at these things. Around noon, when the formal portion wound down and people were clustered in smaller groups near the food, I noticed Ryan standing near the front window. He wasn't talking to anyone. He was looking out through the glass toward the sidewalk, not at anything in particular. Just looking. His expression was the kind you wear when you're deciding something. I almost walked over to ask him what he was thinking. Instead, someone from the city planning office pulled me into a conversation about permit timelines. And by the time I looked back, Ryan had moved away from the window and was helping himself to coffee near the back wall. His face had gone back to neutral. I filed it away without knowing what to do with it. The last guests left around 2. Patricia started breaking down the food table. I walked through the office one more time the way I'd walked through it that morning. Touching things. Checking things. Doing the thing I always did when I needed to locate myself in a space. Ryan was still there. Jacket slung over one arm. Waiting. You don't have to stay. I told him. I know, he said. We stood in the empty office in the afternoon light, and he asked if I'd heard from Daniel. The question landed carefully. The way Ryan asked most things, not probing, not pitying, just asking. No. I said. Ryan nodded. He looked at the floor for a moment, then back up at me. He knew about it. He said. I mentioned it to him a few weeks ago. He knew the date. I didn't say anything to that. What was there to say? Daniel had known. And Daniel had not come. And that was a sentence I'd been practicing in different forms for 3 years, and had not yet found a way to finish without it costing me something. I'm glad you were here, I told Ryan. And I meant it the way you mean something when you've run out of room for anything more complicated. He left around 2:30. I stayed until 5, going over invoices with Patricia, and doing the kind of small administrative work that has no emotional content and therefore felt exactly right for that afternoon. I drove home in the early evening traffic, and somewhere on the highway I registered the fact that the proudest day of my professional life had ended and my son had not been part of it. I had been building toward that office for 27 years. I had been building toward Daniel for 24. The radio played something I didn't hear. I took the exit I always took. I parked in the driveway of the house I'd bought when the divorce settlement was done. A 3-bedroom colonial, on a street where people walk dogs in the evening. And I sat in the car for a while with the engine off, listening to it cool. Then I went inside and called no one. Daniel called the next morning at 9:47. I was at my drafting table with a set of preliminary drawings for a small commercial Projecta coffee roaster out of the East Side who wanted to expand into a second location when the phone rang and his name came up on the screen. I set down my pencil and let it ring one more time before I answered. Not because I was trying to make a point, just because I needed a second to decide what kind of conversation I wanted to have. Hey, he said when I picked up. Hey. There was the brief pause that had become standard in our calls, the quarter-second gap, where in another version of our relationship we might have launched straight in. But in this one we always waited to see who would set the tone. How did it go, he asked. Not I'm sorry I couldn't make it. Not I heard it went well. Not even I was thinking about you. Just how did it go? The way you'd ask a colleague about a quarterly review you'd heard was happening. It went well. I said, good turnout. The space looked right. That's great, he said, and he sounded like he meant it, not effusively, not performed. Just a genuine, quiet. That's great. That landed like someone watching a game they'd been following from a distance. Pleased but not present. I left you a voicemail. I said, yeah, I saw that. Sorry I missed it. I let that sit for a moment. Outside my window, a neighbor was mowing a lawn that didn't need mowing. The way people do on weekday mornings when they're retired and the days need structure. I watched the mower go back and forth and said, it would have been good to have you there. Daniel. There was a longer pause this time. Long enough that I thought for a half-second about what might be happening on the other end of the line, whether he was standing still or moving around. Whether his jaw had tightened the way it did when he was working through something he didn't know how to say. I know, he said finally. I'm sorry. 2 words. And the strange thing was, they didn't sound hollow. They sounded worn, like a garment that had been washed so many times the shape of it had changed. He was sorry, and the sorry had been sitting on him for a while. And that was somehow worse than if he'd just been indifferent. We talked for another 6 minutes. He asked about the location. I described the warehouse conversion. He said it sounded like what I'd always wanted. I said it was. Then he said he had to get to work, and I said okay, and we hung up. I sat at the drafting table for a long time after that without touching the drawings. Something about that call didn't fit the pattern I'd assembled over 3 years. The pattern was distance, brevity, the occasional text, the twice-a-year dinner where we were careful with each other in the way of 2 people who have agreed, without saying so, to stay in the shallow end. The pattern did not include phone calls the morning after something significant. The pattern did not include apologies that sounded like they'd been held for a while. I picked up the pencil and set it back down. That afternoon, my phone buzzed with a text from Sandra, my ex-wife. We communicated through lawyers when it was about the ongoing case and through silence when it wasn't. So, seeing her name in my messages was unusual enough that I read it twice to make sure I was reading it right. Was it everything you hoped for, that was all? 5 words. No punctuation at the end. And no follow-up. I read it a third time. I put the phone face down on the table and went back to the drawings. But the sentence stayed with me, threading itself through the afternoon in a way I couldn't shake. Was it everything you hoped for? It was a strange question from someone who was currently trying to claim 22% of the company I'd just opened. Not hostile, and that was the part that bothered me. It wasn't sarcastic. It wasn't pointed. It sounded almost like concern. That evening I called Patricia to go over a few things about the following week's calendar. And toward the end of the call I mentioned Daniel. He called this morning. I told her. How was that Patricia had been with me for 9 years and knew most of the contours of the situation without needing them explained. Strange. I said. He asked how it went. He apologized. There was a beat. That's not nothing, she said carefully. No, I agreed. But it's also not him being there. When we hung up, I sat at the kitchen table with a legal pad and wrote down. In the neat column format I used for everything from site notes to grocery lists. The things that were adding up to something I couldn't yet name. Daniel called the morning after. Knew the date. Didn't come. Called the next day. Daniel sounded sorry in a way that didn't sound like indifference wearing an apology as a coat. Sandra texted. Unprompted. Not hostile. That specific question. I looked at the list for a while. Then I added a fourth line. Ryan was at the window at noon. Looking out? Deciding something. I had been in the business of working with physical evidence long enough to know that when 4 details feel wrong in the same direction, you don't explain them away individually. You ask what they have in common. I didn't have an answer yet, but the question had arrived. And questions like that, in my experience, don't leave on their own. The next 3 days were ordinary in the way that the period before a large discovery is always ordinary, everything the same. Nothing resolved. The discomfort sitting in the background like an unfinished calculation. I threw myself into the coffee roaster project and a preliminary consult for a residential addition out in the county. And I ate dinner at the same time each evening, and went to bed at a reasonable hour, and tried to treat the list on the legal pad as something I would return to when the time was right. On the 4th day, I got a text from Ryan. Hey, I was going through photos from the opening, and there's one I think you should see. Can I send it? I typed back. Go ahead. The photo came through 30 seconds later. It was taken from inside the office. Angled toward the front window, a background shot. The kind that happens when your camera is pointed at the room and your eye is on the people inside, but the window is in the frame. The interior of the office was bright in the foreground. Slightly overexposed the way indoor-outdoor shots get when the photographer hasn't compensated for the light differential. And there in the glass, caught by the reflective quality of the large factory pane, rendered in that slightly ghosted way of things on the other side of glass, on a bright day, was a figure standing on the sidewalk. Young man, hands in the pockets of a dark jacket, not moving, facing the building, even with the image quality, even through the glass, even across the year and change since I'd last seen him in person. I knew my son's posture. I knew the way Daniel stood when he was working through something weight on his left foot. Slight forward, lean in the shoulders, chin down. I had watched that posture across dinner tables and graduations, and the afternoon we moved him into his college dorm, and I had carried it in my memory like a reference point. He had been there. He had come to the opening. He had stood on the sidewalk outside, for I checked the metadata of the photo when Ryan sent it. Because that is what I do 43 minutes. And he had not come in. I sat at my drafting table and looked at my son standing outside the proudest moment of my life. And I thought about the last 3 years. And something that had been soft in me went very still and very hard in the way that concrete goes when it finally cures. I texted Ryan, can we meet? We met at a diner 2 blocks from my office, the kind of place that's been there since the 80s and has menus laminated so many times the edges have gone yellow. Ryan was already in a corner booth when I arrived. Coffee in front of him. His phone face down on the table. He slid across when I sat down, and we ordered without much preamble, and I put my phone on the table with the photo already open. He looked at it for a moment. Then he looked at me. I didn't notice him until I was going through the pictures that night. He said, I'd taken maybe 30 shots throughout the day. Just candids. And when I got to that one, he paused, rubbing the back of his thumb across his knuckles in a gesture I recognized from Greg. I almost deleted it. I thought it was just a random person on the sidewalk. Then I looked closer. How long were you watching before you took it? I wasn't watching. I didn't know he was there. I was taking a wide shot of the main room and the window was just in frame. He looked at the photo again, but Markashi was there for a long time. I checked the timestamp on the previous photo and this one, and there's 40 minutes between them. He was already on the sidewalk when I took the first shot of the exterior from inside. That's at 10:12. The photo of him is at 10:57. I did the math without needing to. 45 minutes. The formal portion of the opening ran from 10 to noon. Daniel had been standing outside for the first 45 minutes and then left without coming in. I picked up my coffee. It was too hot to drink properly. So I held it. Has he said anything to you? I asked. About why he didn't come in? Ryan's expression shifted. Not reluctance exact, more like the look of someone who has been holding a piece of information carefully and is now deciding how to hand it over. He told me a few weeks before the opening that he didn't think he should come. He said. I asked him why. And he said it was complicated. He said Sandra's lawyer had told him that his being there could affect the case. I set the coffee down. Which case? I said. The corporation ownership dispute. Ryan looked at me steadily. The one where she's claiming part of your company. I kept my voice level. How would Daniel being at my grand opening affect that case? That's what I asked him. Ryan turned the coffee cup in his hands once. Slowly. He didn't have a clear answer. He just said the lawyer told him it would look bad. That it would look like he was taking sides. And that Sandra was fighting to protect his inheritance. So he needed to not make things complicated. The diner was filling up around us with the late morning crowd. And someone nearby was telling a long story about a plumbing situation. And the radio above the counter was playing something with too much bass for the room. I was very aware of all of these things, in the way you become aware of background noise when the thing in the foreground is very quiet. Sandra's lawyer told Daniel. I said, that coming to his father's grand opening would jeopardize a case. That's what Daniel understood. Yes. I thought about that for a moment. I turned it over the way I turn over a structural calculation, checking the load paths. Checking what bears the weight. Checking what would fail first if the premise was wrong. A 24-year-old kid. 3 years into his parents' divorce. Being told by a lawyer his mother hired that showing support for his father at a professional event could harm his financial interests. Not told by Sandra, her told by a lawyer. Given the cover of professional advice. It was elegant. In the way that certain kinds of damage are elegant. It didn't leave fingerprints. Ryan, I said, do you know if Daniel still has any texts or emails from that time? From the lawyer. From Sandra. Anything around when she told him this? I don't know about emails. Ryan picked up his phone, which he'd kept face down, and turned it over deliberately. But I have something. Daniel texted me about it. A few exchanges over a few days before the opening. He slid the phone across the table. I read the thread. Daniel, so I'm not going to make it to Dad's thing. Not trying to be a jerk about it, Ryan. What? Why not Daniel? Sandra's lawyer says it could hurt the case. Like, make it look like I'm validating his ownership or something. IDK Ryan, that doesn't make sense. Daniel, I know it sounds weird, but she says she's been protecting my interests for 3 years, and I can't blow it now. Ryan, did the lawyer contact you directly? Daniel, Sandra told me what the lawyer said. I didn't talk to the lawyer myself. Ryan, Dan. That's not how that works, Daniel. I don't want to lose what she's been holding together for me. Can we talk about this later? I read it twice. Then I set the phone down and moved it back across the table to Ryan. She told him. I said. Not asked. Sandra told him what the lawyer said. He never spoke to the lawyer. No. I picked up my coffee again. It had cooled enough now. I took a sip and looked out the window at the street. At the ordinary Wednesday morning happening on the other side of it. And I let myself sit with what I was now holding. My son had stood outside my office for 43 minutes because his mother had told him a lawyer said he shouldn't go in. Not because he didn't want to be there. Not because he'd chosen her side over mine. Because someone had handed him a rule that sounded official and had no actual basis. and he was 24, and he'd been navigating his parents' divorce for 3 years, and he didn't have the framework yet to know when a legal-sounding thing is not actually a legal thing. He'd been standing 40 feet from me. I excused myself, went to the men's room, ran cold water over my wrists, the way my mother used to tell me to do when I was a kid and needed to calm down, and stood at the sink long enough to get my breathing back to the pace I needed it at. Then I went back to the table, ordered a second coffee, and pulled out the small moleskin I kept in my jacket pocket. I need you to tell me everything you remember, I said to Ryan. Every conversation, every detail, everything that felt off. From the beginning, he told me. I wrote it down, not because I didn't trust my memory, but because I had learned a long time ago that the act of writing makes you slower and more precise. And slow precision was exactly what this required. It took an hour and 40 minutes. When we were done, I looked at the notes and then at Ryan and said, I'm going to need you to hold on to that text thread. Don't delete it. Don't screenshot it anywhere else. Don't forward it. Just keep it. Okay, he said. And I need to make some calls this week. To a lawyer. Possibly to a forensic document specialist. I looked back at the notes. There's a signature authorization that Sandra's attorney filed last spring claiming I'd given her power of attorney over a holding account connected to the company. I never signed anything like that. I told my lawyer at the time and he said we'd address it. But I let it move to the back of the queue because there were bigger items on the docket. Ryan was quiet for a moment. You think the signature is forged? I think I never signed that document, I said. And I think there may be a connection between that document and the pressure being put on Daniel. And I think I've been waiting for the right moment to address it, and there is no right moment. There's just the moment you're in. I closed the moleskin. The photo was still open on my phone. My son standing on the sidewalk in his dark jacket, caught by accident by a camera that wasn't looking for him. I looked at it one more time before I put the phone in my pocket. He'd come. He'd been there the whole time. That changed everything. And it changed nothing. And it changed everything again. I have spent my career working with physical things materials with tensile strength to compression values. Tolerance is measured in fractions of inches. When something doesn't hold, I look for the failure point. I don't guess. I measure. I applied that to the next 6 weeks the same way. The first call I made was to Eleanor Marsh, a family law attorney out of downtown who specialized in high-conflict divorces and had a reputation for being methodical to a degree that other lawyers found either impressive or annoying, depending on which side of the table they were on. I'd been referred to her 8 months ago by a colleague whose own divorce had gone sideways in a similar direction, and I'd put off calling because I told myself my current attorney was handling things adequately. He was, but adequately is not the same as thoroughly, and I was no longer interested in adequate. Eleanor took the case review appointment on a Thursday morning. I arrived with a 3-ring binder I'd assembled over the previous 4 days, the corporate ownership documents, the contested power of attorney filing from the previous spring, the chronology of Sandra's claim against the company's shareholding, and a printed copy of the photo from Ryan, along with the text thread he'd sent me in a screenshot I'd asked him to send after all, for the file. I had also printed, from memory and from the calendar records I kept meticulously, a timeline of every point of contact with Daniel over the past 3 years, annotated with my assessment of his emotional register in each exchange. Eleanor read through the binder without speaking for 22 minutes. I sat across from her and looked out her window at the parking structure across the street and thought about load-bearing columns. The power of attorney document, she said finally. You're certain you didn't sign this? I'm certain I didn't sign it, I said. I also have no memory of ever seeing that document prior to it appearing in opposing counsel's filing last April. Your current attorney's response was to flag it as disputed and move on. Yes. She set the page down with a deliberateness that told me she had a different view of that decision. I'd like to have this reviewed by a forensic document examiner before we do anything else with the case, she said. If the signature is forged, this changes the complexion of everything Sandra's attorney has built on top of it. It may also open other questions. I was going to suggest the same thing. She looked at me over the top of her reading glasses. You don't seem surprised by any of this. I'm not surprised, I said. I've been slow. There's a difference. Eleanor retained a forensic document examiner named Harold Fenn, who worked primarily for insurance companies and occasionally for law firms in cases exactly like this one. He was 63, quiet, wore bifocals, and had the specific brand of patience that comes from spending decades looking at things other people have overlooked. I met with him once, briefly, to hand over the original document from my files, the version I'd kept since April, which I had been meticulous enough to request a physical copy of from my prior attorney's office before making any other moves. Harold said he'd need 2 weeks. In those 2 weeks, I did the other work. I went through every financial document connected to the company from its formation 18 months ago, operating agreements, the capital contributions, the bank records, and I went through them, the way I go through blueprints, looking not for what's there, but for what should be there and isn't. I found 3 points where a power of attorney, had it been legitimate, would have created transaction records. Those records didn't exist. The account had never actually been accessed using that authorization, which meant one of two things: either the authorization had been created for use later, or it had been created for the sole purpose of establishing Sandra's claim to a percentage of the company through a document that looked like I'd consented to her involvement. I called Eleanor with my analysis. That's consistent with what I'd expect, she said. If the signature is forged, the document likely wasn't used to make actual transaction, as it was filed to create a legal basis for the claim. A paper right rather than an exercised right. A foundation, I said, built on material that won't carry the load. There was a brief pause. That's one way to put it, she said. In the 3rd week, I drove to Daniel's apartment. I had not called ahead. I had thought about it and decided against it. Not because I wanted to catch him off guard, but because I knew from 3 years of experience that a phone call gave him a structure he could manage from a distance. And I needed to be in the same room with him for this conversation. I needed to see his face. He lived in a 2nd-floor apartment in a building near the University District, was working at a design software company. An entry-level project coordinator role he'd gotten 8 months after graduation. When I rang the buzzer, there was a long pause before his voice came through the intercom. Dad, yeah. Can I come up? Another pause. Then, yeah. Come up. His apartment was the apartment of a 24-year-old who was trying to figure out what kind of person he was going to be. Some things very orderly. Some things not at all. A bookshelf that was half organized and half stacked. A kitchen that had clearly been cleaned recently, but had a coffee maker with a ring of old residue around the base. He had his mother's taste in furniture and my taste in lamps, which I had never told him and probably never would. He stood in the middle of the living room with his arms slightly out from his sides, the way he'd stood as a kid when he was trying to figure out what the situation was going to require of him. Is something wrong? He asked. No, I said, but I need to talk to you about something. Can we sit down? We sat. I didn't have the moleskin with me this time. I'd left it deliberately in the car because I didn't want this to look like an interrogation. I wanted it to look like what it was: a father trying to understand what had happened. I told him about the photo. I watched his face. His expression went through 3 things very quickly: surprise, something I can only describe as being caught, and then, and this was the one that told me everything I needed to know, relief. Not guilt. Relief. Like a person who has been carrying something wrong and has just been given permission to set it down. You were there, I said. He looked at his hands. Yeah. 43 minutes. Outside. He nodded, still looking at his hands. I didn't know what to do. I got there and I was standing on the sidewalk and I could see people inside. And I wanted to. He stopped. Started again. Mom's lawyer said it would hurt the case. That me being there would be like I was endorsing your claim to the company. And she's been fighting for 3 years to protect my inheritance. And I didn't want to be the reason she lost. Did you speak to the lawyer yourself? He looked up. What's Sandra's lawyer? Did you speak to them directly about this? Did they tell you this personally? In a phone call or a meeting? He was quiet for a moment. Mom told me what they said. I held very still. Okay, I said. Daniel, I want you to hear me say something clearly. I am not angry with you. I need you to know that first. I waited until he was looking at me. What I'm telling you is that the legal reasoning you were given does not exist. There is no legal principle by which your presence at a public event held by one of your parents affects the other parent's litigation position. That's not how it works. He stared at me. I've talked to a lawyer, I said. A new one. She confirmed it. Your being at that opening would have had zero effect on your mother's case. Zero. The silence in the apartment was the kind that has weight. Then why Daniel stopped. His jaw moved slightly, the way it did when he was working through the gap between what he believed and what he was being told was true. Why would she say that? I didn't answer that immediately. I looked at the bookshelf, at the orderly half and the stacked half, and I thought about foundations and the things you build on top of them. I don't know the full answer to that yet. I said, but I'm working on it, and I want you to know what I'm working on. I told him about the power of attorney document. I told him I had a forensic examiner looking at the signature. I told him that Eleanor Marsh was now handling my case. I told him all of this the same way I told him things when he was 8 and something difficult was happening directly, completely, treating him as someone who deserved to have the whole picture. He listened without interrupting. His arms moved from his sides to crossed in front of him. Not defensive more, like he was holding something in. When I was done, he was quiet for a long moment. I've been thinking something was wrong for a while, he said finally. I didn't know which part was wrong. I know, I said. That's what this kind of thing does. I stayed for another hour. We didn't resolve anything. There wasn't anything yet to resolve. The reports weren't back. The case was still open. The ground was still unstable. But we had a conversation with each other in the same room in which we were both being direct for the first time in 3 years. And that was worth more than any piece of paper I could have walked in with. When I left, Daniel walked me to the door of his building. And before I got in the car, he said, I'm sorry I didn't come in. I know you're sorry. I said, and I need you to understand that what kept you out wasn't you. Harold Fenn's report came 12 days later. I was at my drafting table when Eleanor called, and I set down the pencil and didn't pick it back up for a while after we were done. The signature on the power of attorney document was not mine. Harold's report was 14 pages and cited 7 distinct points of variance between the signature on the document and a comparison set drawn from my signature on the operating agreement, the original lease, and the bank account establishment forms, all of which predated the divorce proceedings. The pressure pattern was wrong. The terminal stroke was wrong. The angle of the capital M was wrong in a way that was small enough to miss casually and large enough to be definitive. 3 years of litigation. A claim against my company. My son standing outside my building for 43 minutes because he'd been told the law required it. And a signature that was not mine on a document that was supposed to prove I'd consented to all of it. I opened the moleskin and added a new column to the list. Then I called Eleanor and told her it was time to move. Eleanor was the one who suggested the format a structured settlement conference, framed to opposing counsel as a last attempt at resolution before we moved to amend our filings and introduce the forensic report. A settlement conference sounded conciliatory. It was not intended to be conciliatory. It was intended to put Sandra in a room where she could not manage the narrative by controlling who received information and in what order. Sandra's attorney, a man named Gerald Fitch, who had been handling her case since the beginning, and who I had come to think of as a careful man, someone who was smart enough to build a case on uncertain ground and cautious enough not to step on it, himself agreed to the meeting. His agreement told me something he didn't know about the forensic report yet. If he had known, he would have found a reason to postpone. We set the date for a Thursday morning at Eleanor's office. The night before, I called Ryan. He answered on the second ring. Tomorrow's the day. I said, yeah. A pause. How are you doing? I'm clear, I said. It was the most accurate word I had for it. I need you to be there. Not as a lawyer. Not as anything official. Just as someone who was at the opening and who has the text thread on his phone. Eleanor's already talked to you about what that means. I'll be there, he said. And Daniel's coming. I said. He agreed. I had asked Daniel 2 weeks ago. After a long conversation in which I had laid out everything I knew and given him the choice without any pressure attached to it, he'd said yes without hesitating, which told me something about who he'd been becoming quietly in the months since my visit to his apartment. I want you two in the room. There was a pause on Ryan's end. Your late best friend's kid and your son, he said. That's a room. It's the right room. I said. In the morning I arrived 40 minutes early. The way I arrive for everything. Eleanor's office was on the 14th floor of a building downtown with a conference room that had windows on two sides and a table made of dark wood that was long enough to establish clear geography. I sat at my customary end, facing the door. Ryan arrived at 8:50 and took the chair to my right. Daniel arrived at 8:55 in a dark jacket, different from the one in the photo, but the same basic shape, and sat to my left. He looked tired but present. The way people look when they've decided to do something difficult and have been up thinking about it. Eleanor arranged the documents on her end of the table in a sequence I'd reviewed with her the previous afternoon. 3 packets. Face down. Sandra and Fitch arrived at 9 on the dot. Sandra was 51. Still sharp-faced and composed in the way she had been composed throughout the entire divorce, perfectly assembled. The kind of woman who wore control like a tailored jacket and never let it wrinkle. She saw Daniel and her expression shifted for exactly half a second before going back to neutral. She saw Ryan and didn't recognize him immediately. Then she sat down across from me and folded her hands on the table. Fitch opened. We're here to explore resolution of the outstanding shareholding claim. Our position remains I'd like to start somewhere specific, I said. I kept my voice at the same register I used for every meeting. If that's all right. Fitch looked at Eleanor. Eleanor indicated I could proceed. I picked up my phone and set it face up in the center of the table, displaying the photo from the opening. Ryan's photo. Daniel on the sidewalk in a dark jacket, hands in his pockets. 40 feet from the door he hadn't walked through. Sandra looked at it. Her hands didn't move. This was taken at 10:57 on the morning of my company's grand opening. I said, "You sent me a message that afternoon asking if it was everything I hoped for." I let that sit for one beat. I thought that was an unusual question at the time. I understand it better now. Fitch started to say something. I continued, "You told our son." I said not toward her lawyer. Toward Sandra that his attendance at a public professional event held by his father would damage your litigation position. That his presence there would constitute some kind of legal endorsement that could cost him his inheritance. I looked at her steadily. You used your attorney's name to deliver that message. But Daniel never spoke to your attorney directly. You told him what the attorney said. Silence. Was it the attorney's advice? I said, or playing, or yours. Sandra's jaw moved. Marcus. This is he stood outside for 43 minutes. I said, he was 40 feet from the door. He wanted to be there. I heard. From my left. Daniel's breathing changed slightly. He wanted to be there, and he didn't come in because you told him a rule that doesn't exist. That's a mischaracterization of. Take your time, Eleanor said, with a pleasantness that was not pleasant at all. We have the room all morning. Sandra looked at her lawyer. Fitch leaned over and said something low near her ear. She straightened. Daniel is an adult, she said. I shared information with him. He made his own decision. I watched her. I watched the precision of that construction shared information. His own decision. The legal responsibility outsourced, and the emotional responsibility disclaimed in one sentence. Elegant. She had always been elegant about this. You shared information. I repeated. I said it back at exactly her register, the way she'd said it, and let it stand in the air between us. That's what we're calling it. Daniel shifted to my left. I glanced at him. He was looking at his mother with an expression that had something newly fixed in it, not angry, not wounded, just settled. Like a door that had been slightly ajar for a long time had finally been pushed closed. I want to tell you something, Daniel said. His voice was even. Sandra looked at him, and something in her face moved a maternal reflex. Her reach toward the version of this where he was still someone she could reorient. I was there, he said. Dad's right. I was standing outside for almost an hour, and I wanted to go in, and I didn't because you told me I couldn't. He paused. I want you to know that I understand now that that wasn't the truth. And I want you to know that I needed a long time to be able to say that out loud. The conference room was quiet enough that you could hear the ventilation. Sandra opened her mouth. Daniel held up one hand, a small, precise gesture. Nothing dramatic. I'm not done, he said. She closed her mouth. I don't know yet how I feel about it, Daniel said. That's going to take more time than this meeting. But I know what happened, and I'm not going to pretend I don't anymore. Eleanor. with the timing of someone who understood exactly what the room required. Slid the first document packet from her end of the table toward the center. "I'd like to direct everyone's attention to Exhibit 1, she said. "This is a forensic document examination report from Harold Fenn, certified forensic document examiner, regarding the power of attorney document submitted by your client in April of last year." Fitch reached for the packet. He opened it. I watched him read the first page summary. I watched his face go through the specific transition of a careful man encountering information that changes everything he thought was solid beneath him. "The signature on that document," Eleanor continued, "has been determined, with a high degree of certainty, to not be Marcus's signature. The report identifies 7 distinct points of variance. I've included the comparative analysis in the appendix." Sandra was looking at Fitch now, not at the packet. Fitch was still reading. His expression had the quality of someone counting exits. "On the basis of this finding," Eleanor said, still at the same even pace she'd kept throughout, "we will be filing a motion to dismiss the shareholding claim in its entirety and submitting this report as supporting documentation. We will also be requesting that the court review the circumstances under which this document was submitted, which may raise additional questions outside the scope of the current civil matter." The last phrase, "outside the scope of the current civil matter," was a quiet reference to the fact that submitting a forged document to a court was not a civil issue. Fitch closed the packet. He looked at Sandra and said nothing. This was, I understood, a kind of answer. Sandra said, "I'd like a few minutes." "Of course," Eleanor said. She and I and Ryan and Daniel stood and moved to the outer office. Eleanor's assistant brought coffee no one drank. Ryan stood by the window and looked at the parking structure across the street. Daniel stood next to me. "You okay?" I asked him. He thought about it for a moment. "Not entirely," he said, "but I'm here." "That's enough," I said. "That's all I wanted." After 11 minutes, Fitch came to the door. "My client would like to discuss terms," he said. He did not look at me directly, which told me Gerald Fitch had known about the power of attorney document and had chosen not to look too closely, and was now reckoning with what it meant to have been used in that way by a client. We went back in. The negotiation that followed took 3 hours and was conducted with the precision of 2 engineering firms arguing over a load specification, everything measured, everything documented, nothing left ambiguous. Eleanor was the best version of what I'd hoped for. By the end of the morning, Sandra had agreed to withdraw the shareholding claim with prejudice. The power of attorney document would be formally flagged as disputed in the record. Whether the court chose to pursue additional inquiry was outside our hands. And I had already decided not to push for criminal referral, not because I didn't have grounds, but because the cost of that extended fight on Daniel's relationship with his mother was something I was not willing to spend. That was my call to make. And I made it, before they left. Sandra looked at me once across the table, not with remorse. Exactly. More, with the expression of someone who had played a long game and had lost, and was recalibrating what came next. I didn't say anything to her. There was nothing left that needed saying. What I thought about, in the moment she held my eyes, was the sentence she had given to my son the week before the opening. "Your father has always chosen his business over his family. Today will prove it." She had been so certain that Daniel's absence would be the proof. And instead, what the day proved was that he'd been there the whole time. That he'd chosen even under pressure, even badly advised, even standing outside in the cold for 43 minutes to at least be close. She'd handed me the test and he'd passed it in a way she hadn't anticipated. I hadn't anticipated it either. Some things you only understand in the rear view. The shareholding claim was formally withdrawn 11 days after the conference. Eleanor filed the withdrawal notice and sent me a copy by email at 4 p.m. on a Tuesday. And I read it at my drafting table and set my phone down and went back to the drawings I'd been working on for a commercial lobby renovation in the West Corridor. I worked until 6:30 and then went home. I had expected to feel more. What I felt was the specific quiet of a load being removed from a structure, not exhilarating. Just the absence of the stress that had been there. A return to the baseline. The building still needed to stand on its own, which was the whole point. The foundation had just been cleared of something that had been falsely attached to it. Sandra's attorney sent a final letter 2 weeks after the withdrawal, closing the matter on his end. Gerald Fitch resigned from her case shortly after Eleanor heard this through the professional network that runs beneath the surface of every legal community, and confirmed it casually in a call about an unrelated administrative matter. Whether Fitch resigned because he was disgusted or because he was protecting himself from proximity to what had been filed, I would never know. It didn't matter. What mattered was that Sandra no longer had an attorney who knew the case and no longer had a document to build on. And the architecture of the past 3 years of litigation had been dismantled piece by piece from the foundation up. Whether the court chose to inquire further into the document's origins was something Eleanor said could take months to determine, and might amount to nothing beyond the civil record. I had submitted the report and filed the flag, and let the process do what processes do. The outcome, there was not mine to control, and I had made peace with that. The part that cost me more was Daniel, not the conference. Not the conversation in his apartment. Not even the 3 years before it. The cost was subtler than any of that. It was the slow recognition that there were years I had spent holding a version of my son that was not accurate. I had believed, without ever quite saying it to myself, that he had pulled away because he'd chosen Sandra's side, that the brief texts and the missed calls and the general absence were a kind of quiet verdict on my value as a father. I had carried that. I had organized my behavior around it. I had given him space because I thought that was what he wanted. And in doing so, I had given him 3 years of a father who was waiting at a respectable distance while a wall was being built between them. I thought about this on a Sunday morning about a month after the withdrawal, sitting at the kitchen table with coffee. I hadn't started drinking yet. And the thing I felt was not anger and not grief, exacta more like a retroactive ache, the way a joint feels when it's healed from an injury you sustained before you knew what you'd done to it. I wrote in the moleskin for a while. Not notes. Not lists. Something closer to thinking out loud in handwriting. Daniel and I started having dinner together about once every 2 weeks. It was not immediately easy. 3 years of careful distance doesn't dissolve in a conference room. What it does is leave a residue. A habit of guardedness that both people have to consciously work against. We were both working against it. Which helped. He talked about his job with more specificity than he ever had before, the project coordination work. The software. A team lead he found difficult but was learning from. I told him about the coffee roaster project. About the lobby renovation. About a small residential commission that had come in through a referral from the opening. Once, halfway through dinner at a Thai place near his apartment, he asked me, "Were you angry at me?" During all of it, I thought about that for a moment, turning it over the right way before I answered. "No," I said. "I was sad." And I told myself I wasn't. And that took up most of the space where anger would have gone. He nodded slowly. "I was angry at you," he said. "For a while? Before I understood what was happening. I thought you just—" He stopped. "I thought you didn't push back hard enough. When she was saying things about you—" "What kind of things?" He told me. I listened. Some of it I'd suspected, some of it I hadn't. I held my chopsticks and listened to my son describe the narrative he'd been given about me over 3 years, not dramatic. Not violent. Just steady and quiet and built into the daily texture of his life with his mother. Small things. The business over family framing. The implication that my professional ambitions had always been the thing I put first. The suggestion, never made outright but present in the shape of how she discussed me, that my love was conditional on his being useful to my story of myself. None of it was shouted. None of it was a campaign. It was the kind of thing that settles into a person's understanding gradually. The way water moves through limestone on a dramatic, not visible from the outside. But eventually it makes a passage where there wasn't one before. I listened to all of it, and then I said, "I'm sorry that was what you had. I'm sorry I didn't see it sooner and push back on it sooner." He looked at me. "You didn't know." "I know," I said, "but I could have asked more questions. I could have pushed through the distance instead of respecting it." I set down the chopsticks. "I confused giving you space with leaving you on your own." He thought about that. "Maybe," he said, "but I also could have called." We were quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I'm glad Ryan was there that day." "So am I," I said, more than I know how to say. Ryan had come for dinner with Daniel and me twice since the conference. And what I observed in those dinners was something I had not expected. Daniel, relaxing in Ryan's presence in a way that was particular, not the way you relax around a friend your own age, but around someone who knew your father well and didn't use that knowledge as leverage. Ryan had known me for 25 years. He'd watched me at my best and at my worst, and had his own grief threaded through it. His father's absence. He didn't explain me to Daniel in those dinners. He just told stories about Greg, about the three of us, about what it had been like in the years before everything had gotten complicated. He made me a full person to my son in a way I hadn't been able to do for myself. That was what Greg had sent him to do. I know that's not how it works. Greg had been gone for 4 years and hadn't known any of this would happen. But grief has a way of making you look for patterns in kindness. And the pattern I saw was this: the man who had been my closest friend for 30 years had raised a son who showed up, who stayed until the end, who took a photo he didn't know would matter, and who handed it to me without knowing what he was handing me. Greg would not have planned that, but he would have recognized it. I was at my drafting table on a Wednesday evening, working late on the lobby renovation, when Daniel knocked on the office door. He hadn't texted ahead, which was new. He had a pizza box and a six-pack, and the look of someone who had just gotten off work and wanted somewhere to be. "Is this okay?" he said. I moved a stack of drawings from the secondary table and made room. "Yeah," I said. "This is okay." We ate, and he looked at the drawings and asked questions about the project, real questions. Specific questions. And at one point he picked up my pencil and made a small notation on the edge of a preliminary sketch. A remark about the sight line from the lobby entrance to the elevator bank. It was a good notation. I told him so. He said, "I always liked drawing." "I know," I said. "You always had the eye." He set the pencil down carefully. The way I set things down, he had my hands. Or I had his. I could never remember which way that inheritance went. "I'm thinking about going back to school," he said, "for design. Not architecture exactly, but adjacent." "Tell me more," I said. He did. We stayed in the office until 10:30. The pizza gone. The drawings spread around us. The Riverside district quiet outside the factory windows. At some point, the conversation moved from career plans to the kind of talk that has no agenda: movies. A trip he'd taken the previous year. An observation he'd made about a building downtown that had always seemed wrong to him from a structural standpoint. I confirmed it was wrong. He laughed. I thought. Sitting there in the office I had built, with 27 years of intention. In the amber light coming off the drafting lamp. With my son talking in the easy way he'd talked when he was 12. This is what had been on the other side of the wall. This specific ordinary evening. This was what had been waiting. It had been 40 feet away for a long time. The hardest thing was not forgiving Sandra. I had decided before the conference that I would spend no energy on that question: not forgiving. Not pursuing. Just removing her from the architecture of my daily decision-making, the way you remove a compromised element from a load path and redirect the forces through something sound. That was the practical work. And I was built for practical work. The harder thing was forgiving myself for the 3 years I'd spent standing at a respectful distance from my own son. Being careful with him when I should have been persistent. Being patient when patience was the wrong tool. I had told myself it was respect for his autonomy. What it partly wasn't. This took me a long time in the mornings at the kitchen table with the cooling coffee to be honest about, was that I was scared. Scared that if I pushed too hard, he'd tell me clearly that the distance was what he wanted, and a clear rejection was worse than an ambiguous one. So I had chosen ambiguity and called it respect. That's the thing I sit with. Not the 3 years. Not Sandra. My own chosen distance from a door that, as it turned out, my son was already standing outside of. Ryan's father used to say that the most dangerous thing in construction wasn't a bad foundation, it was a load-bearing wall you'd misidentified as decorative. You built around it, built on top of it, designed the whole space around the assumption that it wasn't carrying weight. And then one day, you went to take it down and realized what you'd done. I had misidentified a few walls. I know that now, and now that I know it, I don't build the same way I used to. If you've ever been in a situation where a distance grew between you and someone you love, and you couldn't fully account for it, where the story you were given about why things were the way they were didn't quite add up, but you were too tired or too careful or too frightened to push on it, I think you know what I mean when I say that the truth, when it finally arrives, is not always a relief. Sometimes it's both a relief and a loss at once. Sometimes it tells you how much was salvageable that you treated as lost. What I know is this: Ryan walked into that office on the morning of the opening and stayed until the end. And 8 months later, he sent me a photograph that changed what I understood about my own son. He did it without trying to be anything other than what he was. That's enough of a legacy for any man to leave. The office is doing well. We took on 3 new clients in the second quarter, and Patricia has started making noises about needing a second project coordinator, which is a good problem to have. Daniel has submitted his application to a design program on the other side of the city. He texted me when he hit submit, which is not nothing. I texted back, good. He texted, yeah. And that was the whole exchange. And it was exactly right. The sign above the door still says, Hale Design Group. Some mornings when I get there early and the light comes in through the factory windows, I stand at the glass and look out at the sidewalk for a moment. The sidewalk is empty now, but I know what it looked like when it wasn't. If this story made you think of someone, a parent, a child, a distance that doesn't quite make sense, I'd really like to hear about it in the comments. We spend a lot of time assuming we know why the people we love stay away. Sometimes we're wrong. Tell me where you're watching from today. And if this is your first time here, hit subscribe. I put out new stories every week, and every one of them is true in the ways that count.